Good day. This is the Corrupt True Crime Podcast, and I'm Charlie Cruz. Today's episode is about how cutting-edge DNA analysis and forensic breakthroughs completely transformed our understanding of one of New York City's most notorious cases, the wrongful conviction of 5 teenagers that shook America's justice system to its core. The interrogation room is cramped, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. 15-year-old Yusef Salam sits across from detectives who've been questioning him for hours. No parents, no lawyer, just a scared kid, and 2 men insisting they already know he's guilty. Tell us what happened in the park, they say for the 100th time. Just tell us, and you can go home. Here's what you need to understand about false confessions. They're not just something that happens to weak people or criminals with guilty consciences. They happen to innocent teenagers who've been awake for 30 hours straight, who believe that cooperation means freedom, who trust that the system protects people telling the truth. And what happened in Central Park that spring evening would become one of the most devastating miscarriages of justice in American history. A case where the real crime wasn't committed by the 5 young men who went to prison, but by the system that put them there. This is the story of the Central Park Five, later renamed the Exonerated Five. And it's not about clever criminals. It's about a clever prosecution built on nothing but coerced confessions, public hysteria, and a narrative that fit perfectly into the fears of the moment. 5 teenagers from Harlem, Yusef Salam, Antron McCrae, Raymond Santana, Kevin Richardson, and Corey Wise, ages 14 to 16. They weren't criminal masterminds. They were kids who happened to be in Central Park one evening when something terrible happened blocks away from where they were. A female investment banker was attacked while jogging. She was found hours later, barely alive, with no memory of the attack. The city demanded answers immediately. The media whipped up a frenzy. And the police, under enormous pressure to solve this high-profile case, rounded up teenagers who'd been in the park that night involved in completely separate incidents of harassment. What followed was a masterclass in how to secure a conviction without evidence. And make no mistake, the prosecution knew exactly what they were doing. The scheme here wasn't perpetrated by criminals planning a heist. It was perpetrated by authorities who needed arrests, needed convictions, and were willing to ignore every piece of exculpatory evidence to get them. Here's how they pulled it off. First, bring in teenagers late at night. Separate them from their parents. Tell them they're just witnesses, not suspects. Then interrogate them for 14, 20, even 30 hours straight. Use what's called the Reed technique: confrontational, aggressive, relentless. You're not asking if they did it. You're telling them you already know they did it, and the only question is whether they cooperate now or make things worse. Antron McCrae's father was told that if his son cooperated, he could go home. 14-year-old Raymond Santana was confused, exhausted, saying whatever seemed to make the questioning stop. Yusef never even signed a written confession, but his oral statements were used against him anyway. Kevin Richardson, the youngest, cracked after hours of psychological pressure, and Corey Wise, 16 years old, only there to support his friend, ended up interrogated and ultimately tried as an adult. Each teenager gave a different story, different locations in the park, different participants, different sequences of events. The confessions contradicted each other on fundamental facts, the kind of contradictions that should have immediately signaled these weren't reliable accounts. But here's the brilliant, horrifying part of the prosecution's strategy. They argued that the contradictions proved the chaos of a group attack. They took statements that didn't match as evidence of multiple perspectives on the same crime. They built corroboration out of inconsistency, and they had one massive advantage: juries trust confessions. Even when the physical evidence says otherwise, even when the stories don't align, people believe that innocent folks don't confess to crimes they didn't commit. It's counterintuitive. It feels impossible, which made it the perfect foundation for a case with no actual evidence. Because let's be clear about what the prosecution didn't have. No DNA match to any of the 5 teenagers. No blood on their clothing, no scratches, no injuries consistent with a violent attack. The DNA recovered from the crime scene didn't match anyone they'd arrested. Hair analysis was inconclusive at best. The timeline in the confessions didn't align with the victim's injuries or the medical evidence. What they had were scared kids who'd been broken down psychologically until they said what the detectives wanted to hear. The media played right into it. This was the era of super predator rhetoric, of fears about youth violence, of racial anxieties running high in the city. The coverage was sensationalized, racially charged, presuming guilt before trial. The term wilding got thrown around this idea of teenagers rampaging through the park, despite no evidence such a thing occurred. 2 separate trials, all 5 convicted, sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years, with Corey Wise receiving the longest because he was tried as an adult. But here's where the story shifts, because while those 5 teenagers were sitting in prison cells for a crime they didn't commit, the actual perpetrator was still free. His name was Matias Reyes, a serial attacker who was already harming women in that exact area of Central Park during that same time period. He attacked a pregnant woman. He harmed multiple other victims. His method, his pattern, his DNA, everything pointed to him as the lone attacker in the jogger case. But the prosecution had their convictions. The public had their justice. Nobody was looking for another perpetrator because the case was closed. The 5 men served their sentences. Antron McCrae, 7 years. Raymond Santana, 5 years. Yusef Salam and Kevin Richardson, 7 years each. Corey Wise, 13 years, the longest because of his age at trial and additional time for prison infractions. 13 years of life stolen, teenage years in prison, educational opportunities gone, reputations destroyed, and the entire time they maintained their innocence. Then, something extraordinary happened. Matias Reyes had a religious conversion in prison, and he happened to encounter Corey Wise in the prison system. The guilt overwhelmed him, so he confessed. Not a vague confession, a detailed one. He described things only the actual attacker could know. He explained that he'd acted alone, and critically, they still had DNA evidence from the crime scene. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office investigated. The DNA testing came back definitive. Matias Reyes was a match. His confession was verified by evidence. His method matched his other attacks, and there was no evidence whatsoever supporting the theory of multiple attackers. In late autumn, more than a decade after the original convictions, a New York Supreme Court judge vacated all 5 convictions. The case collapsed entirely. Everything the prosecution had built gone. But here's the maddening part. The convictions were vacated, which is different from being declared innocent. It's a legal technicality that would haunt them. And nobody, not the prosecutors, not the detectives, not anyone involved in securing those false convictions faced consequences. The 5 men sued the city. The lawsuit dragged on for years. The city fought it, refusing to settle, refusing to admit wrongdoing. It wasn't until a new mayor took office that they finally reached a settlement, $41 million total. Roughly $1 million for each year of wrongful imprisonment. Money doesn't give you back your teenage years. It doesn't erase the trauma of being branded a criminal. It doesn't restore the education you missed, the relationships that were destroyed, the life you should have lived. But it was something. Acknowledgement, finally, that a catastrophic injustice had occurred. Where are they now? Yusef Salam became a motivational speaker, an activist, a poet. He was elected to the New York City Council just a few years back. Raymond Santana owns a clothing brand and advocates for reform. Kevin Richardson works in criminal justice advocacy. Antron McCrae lives more privately, understandably, maintaining a low profile. And Corey Wise, the one who served the longest, became one of the most vocal advocates for wrongful conviction reform. He donated significantly to the Innocence Project, which now has a division named after him. The case exposed systemic problems that were impossible to ignore. Interrogation of juveniles without proper safeguards, the reliability of confessions obtained under psychological duress, prosecutorial tunnel vision, racial bias in how cases are investigated and prosecuted. The danger of media influence on justice. It led to reforms. Many jurisdictions now require video recording of interrogations, enhanced protections for juveniles during questioning, greater scrutiny of confession evidence, more awareness of how false confessions happen and why innocent people sometimes admit to crimes they didn't commit. Matias Reyes is still in prison, serving life for his actual crimes. The prosecutors who built a case on coerced confessions, they faced no disciplinary action. Some went on to prestigious positions. The detectives involved? No consequences. That's the uncomfortable reality. The system that failed so catastrophically didn't face the same accountability it demanded from 5 innocent teenagers. This case sits in your mind differently than a heist. Or a con, doesn't it? There's no clever scheme to appreciate here, no audacious plan that almost worked. There's just the devastating reminder that the justice system, the thing we trust to separate truth from lies, innocence from guilt, can fail spectacularly when pressure, prejudice, and shortcuts replace evidence. 5 teenagers lost years of their lives because confessions, even contradictory ones obtained through psychological manipulation, carry enormous weight, because the public demanded quick justice, because the narrative fit too perfectly with existing fears, and because once convictions are secured, the system resists admitting its mistakes with ferocious determination. But here's what stays with me. They survived it. Not just survived, but rebuilt their lives, fought for others facing similar injustices, and turned unimaginable trauma into purpose. That takes a kind of strength that doesn't make headlines, but changes the world quietly, case by case, reform by reform. The Central Park Five became the Exonerated Five, and their names now stand not for a false conviction, but for the possibility of justice, even when it comes far too late. The thing about brilliant schemes is that they are seldom brilliant enough, and no matter how clever you are, the house almost always wins. Now, if you enjoyed our show, tap that follow button and 5 stars in our ratings. Catch you next time.
Grab news. Thomas.